Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on volunteer management. Are you the one in charge of volunteers? I'm Jamie Machik, the education consultant for the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and assisting me today is Shauna Kosegi with the Southwest Wisconsin Library System. So thank you, Shauna. Today, we have Maggie Rose with the Barberton Public Library, and Barberton is in Ohio. It's just south of Akron, which is south of Cleveland. That's why we were talking about weather in Ohio. And she's going to be talking about volunteers in the library. And the reason her screen is a little bit smaller is that her computer just happened to do a big update like 10 minutes ago. So this is plan B. And but don't worry, we are recording today. You will have access to her slides as well post webinar. So we are going to go with this, and as long as we can see things and hear her, then I think that is just fine. So Maggie, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Right, thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be talking to you today about working with volunteers in your library. I really appreciate you all signing in for this. Definitely make sure that you download this presentation. There are links included in it which are going to be helpful to you. So definitely get access to that. And while I'm going through the slides and talking, please type your questions into the chat box. Jamie is going to read them to me. She's going to interrupt me, and that's okay. I asked for that because your questions are usually on the topic that we're talking about. And I want to make sure that we stay on topic and also answer all of your questions and leave no room for doubt, and make sure all of your information needs are met. So definitely type your questions in the chat box and Jamie will get to them. Okay, so today we are going to talk about using volunteers to promote the library's mission and goals. There we go. We are going to talk about using the volunteers to promote the library's mission and goals, how to identify service areas for volunteers, how to create and maintain a volunteer program, how to maintain communication up and down the ladder of that volunteer program. And we're going to talk about working with volunteers with respect and gratitude. It's really important to remember that the volunteers are coming on their own time. They could be doing something else. They might have something better to do, but they're committed to helping the library promote its mission and goals. And so remembering to treat them with respect and gratitude is really, really important. So why are you here? Well, you may be here because it's part of your job description, because you signed up for this. So you are in charge of the entire volunteer program at the library, or you're in charge of a section of the volunteer program at your library, or they want you, they want to begin a volunteer program at your library and they've asked you to locate volunteers. It could be something that you've inherited. There was another person on staff who was in charge of handling the volunteers, but when they left, they kind of rearranged the job duties and you inherited being in charge of volunteers or running a volunteer program. Or it could just be something that you're interested in learning, or you want to become a mentor to library volunteers. Volunteers come in all age ranges, and working with each of them has their specific challenges. Today, we're mainly going to talk about working with adult volunteers. So, I mean, if admin says, do this, you're going to do this. So thank you all for coming, no matter what your reasons. And the first thing we're going to talk about is promoting your library's mission, goals, services, and programming with volunteers. This is the most important thing, is to make sure that your program, whatever the goals of it are, aligns with your library's mission statement and with your library's goals. Because if it isn't good for your library, we wouldn't do it. And volunteers are great for filling in the gaps where we need someone to help us through with this project that we're working on. So why volunteers? Well, You could start adding new services to your existing component of library services. If only you had a few more bodies to do this project. And that's when volunteers come in. Maybe you have a service that's really super popular and you need more bodies to do more work because it's so popular, and that volunteers will allow you to expand your service. Maybe your staff is overworked. Maybe there are just too many tasks on their plate, and that's where volunteers can come in and kind of relieve some of that stress off the staff. Embedded services is another great way to use volunteers. For example, at a senior center, even though the program director at that senior center is getting paid from the senior center, libraries can treat that program director as a library volunteer so that they can embed services, library services at the senior center. Expanding the library community is another reason why volunteers are so important to libraries, because as soon as you put out word, say, on Facebook, or do a little blurb in the local newspaper, it says the library is looking for volunteers, people will jump out of their seats and say, I support the library. And even if they don't have time, that may be an opportunity for them to say, well, I volunteer my checkbook. How much do you need? And then you want to make sure you're using all of your resources. So when it comes to expanding your library community, your patrons are a resource. Your customers are a resource. The people in your community are a resource. They have skills, they have talents, and they have inclinations. And why not bring those into the library, whatever they may be, in a creative way to make use of all of your resources? So, what kind of things are good for volunteers to do for libraries? So, we're going to talk about identifying services for volunteer work. Not everything is appropriate for volunteers. You want to be careful that you don't replace paid staff with unpaid volunteers. If you have a situation where you have a job opening and it's unfilled, and it's probably not a good idea to ask a volunteer to perform those duties unpaid when you are eventually going to pay someone to do those duties. You might as well just hire that volunteer. You want to think about the ethics involved in this, and every state has different ethics laws. I know Ohio's pretty well, but you want to make sure that you maintain an ethical work staff member volunteer balance, because the goal is to relieve your team of unnecessary stress, and it's not to replace them. So be aware of those. So where can you expand your services? You can use volunteers in a summer reading club. You can ask them to do program presentations. If you have a volunteer in the community who is like super into collecting trains, you'd be surprised how many people may also be interested in collecting trains, and they will attend that program. You just have to ask them to volunteer to present this program to the library. Book clubs. A lot of people are passionate about their book clubs. And if you want to run more than 1, 2, 3, maybe even 7 book clubs out of your library, you can, as long as you get the volunteers committed to lead these book groups for you. Also, skills seminars. If you have someone in your community that is really good at knitting, they can put on knitting seminars for you. And these are all things that you can reach out to your community and say, hey, we're looking for someone to volunteer to do this. Or you can find these within your existing pool of volunteers. You can say, oh, did any of you volunteers have anything that you'd like to present here at the library for us? We have an opening in our programming on Wednesday, yada, yada, yada. Some things that volunteers can do are weeding and sometimes shelving, depending on how your library phrases things like that. But I have used in the past, we just print a shelf list and say, hey, can you pull all of these materials? Because we need to check them, because we might be discarding them, but just pull them off the shelves and bring them to me. That way I don't have to leave the public service desk And so, my volunteers being my arms and my legs out in the stacks. Home deliveries, when I ran the home delivery service, we used volunteers exclusively to deliver the books. We staff members did not leave the library to deliver the books. We had volunteers working on this exclusively, and they would develop relationships with their home delivery service clients. Um, and that this was one of those situations where this team of home delivery service volunteers, they were really tight knit, and they would call each other, and it provided them with a sort of camaraderie and that feel good feeling of helping someone, while at the same time allowing the library to provide this amazing service to our community. Digitization projects are a great fit for library volunteers. If you have a collection of local newspapers, or a collection of local church pamphlets, or something, in your local history or genealogy department that is, easily scannable, you can ask volunteers to just, do the digitization for you. Additionally, when it comes to other local history memory products, a lot of it is kind of just data entry. When you participate with other when libraries participate with other services to provide local history information online, you might just want to ask a volunteer, like, hey, you could even do this from home. Here's a group of newspapers. Why don't you upload all the obituaries? That kind of thing. Computer labs are a great way to use younger, older, skilled, and sometimes even non-skilled people can help in the computer lab by just being a body. A lot of us working at the public service desk, we've gone to help someone on the computer, and all it takes is for us to stand next to them, and then poof, they figured it out. So having a volunteer in the computer lab can relieve stress from staff having to get up from their seat, from whatever they're working on, their book orders, their program planning, that kind of thing, to go help someone with the computer, when you can have someone in the computer lab volunteering to help people figure out how to add an extra space in Word. You don't have to be an expert to help someone navigate the internet. You just have to know enough. And volunteers can be incredibly helpful in computer labs. Tech coaching is another way where you can either add or expand services with volunteers in your library. If you have a volunteer who's especially good with their iPad, you can say, hey, do you want to come in, once a week in the evening and sit down with people and show them how to use their iPad? Replace iPad with Kindle, replace iPad with computer, cell phone, Android, iPhone, that kind of thing. And you've got a whole new service that you are providing. And then community story times. Community story times are a great way for volunteers to get out there and provide a story time, like in a setting that isn't the library. Could be schools, could be daycares, could be preschools, could be community rooms in local neighborhoods, could be, story times at a grocery store. If you can get a volunteer who wants to go out into the community and perform story times, because your librarians are doing story times in-house, they can't get out of house, that is where you might want to reach out for a volunteer. So we have our ideas for why we need volunteers. So now let's talk about creating a volunteer program. The most important thing is to communicate clearly the goals and expected outcomes to your team in order to get buy-in. Communicate to your administrative team, communicate to your coworkers team, and communicate to everyone else, because some people may feel threatened that you're going to bring in volunteers to do all these new services, and they'll say, hey, why are you going to bring someone else to do that? Don't you think I can do that? Well, yes, we know you can do that. And that's great. And we're excited for you. Would you like to supervise a volunteer to do this? That's how you'd handle that kind of situation. So what you want to do is kind of set up your volunteer program. And I know, let me see if I can make this any bigger. Nope. Nope, can't make it any bigger. Okay. So on the left-hand column here, we have administrative BuyUp. So you want to make sure that the people above you are totally 100% behind you when it comes to this volunteer program. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to get a written plan and explicitly state your goals and the mission of your plan. Address any ethical issues inside that plan. Make sure you've taught, if you are working in a library that has a union rep, because that might be situations for same work that definitely need to look into that if your library has a union. And then are you going to need background checks for these volunteers? Are they going to be going to people's houses? Are they going to be working with children? Think about the type of work these volunteers are going to be doing, and try to address future issues in this plan. Administration will love a really well thought out plan. They'll love that you seem to cover all the bases, all the future contingencies, that kind of thing. And you want to make sure that you outline the benefits of having this volunteer service. If it's really important to you that you expand this program, bring up the numbers. X amount of libraries are able to provide this program. This program has helped X amount of people, and we want to expand it, and we're going to do it with volunteers. It's going to free up staff, and it's a win-win and win situation. It's a triple win situation on volunteers, and you want to stress this when you write your plan. You want to identify your team members for leadership roles. As I was just saying, if someone says, well, I could do that, why do we have to hire a volunteer? Well, that's when you ask them to be a mentor or have a leadership role somewhere in that in your volunteer organization. You can say, well, if you're so good at home delivery service, do you think you could mind being the point person for all the home delivery service volunteers? So you want to get your staff on board, and you want to give them a role. That way they don't feel left out of the whole volunteer project. You also want to start an interviewing or a vetting process for your volunteers. I have weeded out several volunteers based on an interview, because as soon as a volunteer realizes that they can't just show up whenever they want and do whatever they want and consider that volunteer hours, they are a little bit less interested. But then again, you find some wonderful people and you're talking to them in the interview, and they're like, my neighbor's also interested too. And I'm like, oh, well, you should bring your neighbor in. And you get to know them. And we'll talk more about the interview a little bit later as well. And then you want to make sure that you have clear volunteer position descriptions. Your volunteers are filling a position in your library. That position needs to have a name and a specific description of what the duties are going to be. They need to know when they need to show up, and they need to know how frequently they're going to show up, and exactly what is going to be expected of them. It's unfair to have a volunteer shelving and then to ask them to do something else because they didn't sign up for that and they're doing this for free. So make sure that, and don't put "and other duties as assigned" in a volunteer's job description. We need to be cognizant that they may not be working because they have different needs than the rest of us. So when they sign up for this volunteer position, they know exactly what they're getting into, and they understand and agree that they're able to take on these roles. So how do you find volunteers? Well, social media is a great place to find volunteers because a lot of people are on social media. If you are looking for like teen volunteers, which are really good in the computer lab and for tech coaching as well, you can shout out to their parents on Facebook, because it seems like kids' parents are on Facebook now, maybe not so much the kids anymore. I think the kids are on TikTok. But use digital media to reach out for volunteers and get fun with it, get creative with it. Have you ever wanted to work at the library so bad, but you just couldn't get in? Well, here's your chance. Just have fun with it. There's digital resources, and I've included on this slide here, but it's volunteermatch.org. And this is where This is where it's like a jobs, but it's so you can post, the library is looking for volunteers, and then people who are looking for volunteer work will go to this website to see if there's any interesting, fun volunteer positions available. Also, LinkedIn is a good place to search for volunteers, and then putting ads in the local newspaper, reaching out to high school counselors. Um, Reaching out to a local university for their college work study program. I've worked at a library before where students actually worked for the university, but they worked at the library, if that makes sense. The Friends of the Library, anyone who's a Friends of the Library, invite them to volunteer for library programs, setting up a program. Um, I was about to say making cookies for a program, but since COVID, that's not a thing anymore. Um, Check with your friends at the library. They, even though they're friends of the library and they pay their membership dues, they may not know that there are more opportunities available for them to get further involved. Check if you have a library foundation that helps support your library financially. Check with those members, and then those members might check with their kids, and their kids might check with their friends, and it's just a whole network of helping the library achieve its goals. And then community organization partnerships. I've had really good luck with this one. We were working on a digitization project, and I was working with the local historical society, and the local historical society was really close with the gardening club. And so the local historical society convinced the gardening club to come to the library and do all this work. And it was really fun, and it was really great to see how these connections happen between volunteers. And then, so the recruiting process. So you want to use this process to select the right person for the right seat on the right bus. And that is a paraphrased quote from Jim Collins from his book Good to Great, which I highly recommend. But it's all about realizing what makes this person special and using those talents to the best of everyone's benefit. And that starts with a volunteer application. You want to have a form, basic stuff, name, phone, address, that kind of stuff. But also ask them questions about themselves, their hobbies, their interests. There's going to be a volunteer interview where you're going to sit down and talk with them. You're going to write that job description, and your volunteers are going to need training as well, because there's nothing worse if you have ever been dropped into a situation and expected to know what to do, or expected to know where to go. That's It makes you really uncomfortable, and we don't want our volunteers to be uncomfortable. So making sure they have a semi-formal or formal training day before they actually start their work is important. And then you also want to know ahead of time your volunteer rewards and gratitude program. So when it comes to the job description, as I said, this is going to be something that's going to have to be approved by administration. And it's going to outline the responsibilities of what this volunteer is going to be doing. It's going to note the qualifications needed. Qualifications needed may just be something as familiarity with Microsoft Office products, or able to alphabetize and number things. Your job application is also going to have the time and duration commitment expectations on it. So, if you were asking someone to volunteer for home delivery service, you could say, we expect you to spend 1 hour a week delivering products or delivering library books to our clients. And then you want to list on that job description the contact information for the teammate who's going to be the point person in charge for that volunteer. That way they know who to talk to. Okay, and then so the next step, so you give the volunteer the job description, and then they see all this information and they're still interested, and they say, can I fill out an application? So on this application, it's going to have contact information, the position that they're looking for, what their interests and skills are, their education and work history, because you might be surprised and find that someone has has an advanced degree in literature, and oh, would you like to run a book club? That kind of thing. Permission for background check. Do they have a driver's license and insurance card if they're going to be driving? And their availability schedule. And you want references as well. You want to make sure that your volunteers that are directly providing services to your patrons or customers are definitely vetted, and you want to be able to say, hey, all of our volunteers go through a background check and we check their references, just like you would for any other job. You want to get a feel for them as much as possible. And volunteers are different from employees. They're not compensated, and that's what we're talking about. And they're doing us a favor, and it's a kindness to us. So it's up to us to make sure that we find work for them that is stimulating and rewarding and appropriate for their level of commitment, or else we've failed them. So it's important to find the right person for the right job and put them together. So when you're interviewing for a volunteer position, you want to make sure that you introduce, the other team members, that make sure that you have an informal attitude, and you want to make sure that you find out whether or not they're a good fit, and you want to find out their motivation for volunteering. And then you also want to have, if you're running the volunteer program, but you have another teammate who is the one who's going to be the point person for the specific volunteer position, then you want to have them at that interview as well. Offer them coffee, talk about books, interests, really get to know the person. If you get a, creepy vibe, that person might not be the best person for public work, that kind of thing. So, training. Did I miss a slide? Volunteer applicant. Okay, we'll probably come back to that. It's the one I'm looking for later. So with the training program, what you're going to do is you're going to create an onboarding checklist. I have started new positions where the first day they give you an onboarding checklist of all the things you need to do. Get your keys, get your picture taken, get your staff locker, order your name badge, that kind of stuff. And you want to do something similar with your volunteers. It will give them a sense of place and prepare them for what is coming. Keys and badges, are they going to need keys and badges? They should probably have a badge that says that they are a volunteer, because it makes them feel like part of the team. You want to give them a tour of not only their workspace, but of the entire library. Give them the whole behind the scenes nickel tour. I mean, show them the stuff that nobody knows about, because that'll help keep them invested in the library. You want to give them a volunteer manual, guidelines, and best practices. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, your volunteer manual it's basically like a staff manual, but it's for volunteers, and it kind of outlines stuff like what to wear. You wouldn't want to volunteer coming to the library wearing something political. It outlines who to contact versus what kind of thing, that kind of thing. And then sign-in sheets. If you keep track of your volunteer hours, as you should be keeping track of your volunteer hours, so that you can report them to the board, because volunteer hours make your library look better. You say the community donated 180 hours of their time this month to helping the library meet its goals. That really shows that your community is really invested in your library. Okay, volunteer recognition. So do little things for your volunteers, like show them the places in the library that no one gets to see, or maybe they get to kind of look at the brand new books that come in before their release date. Just look at them, not read them, of course. Do they have access? Give your volunteers access to advanced reader copies. If your library gets advanced reader copies, let your volunteers go through them first. Give them access to the staff room. You know, if they've been working, they might want to sit down and take a load off as well. And are they allowed to park in staff parking spaces, or do they have their own special parking area? Unpaid labor is not free, and you want to award them, you know, volunteer level staff perks. You want to throw recognition events for them, like a volunteer luncheon, where all the volunteers are invited to come to the library, and the library feeds them, and they can all visit with each other and talk. That kind of thing. So make sure that your program includes regular volunteer recognition in some form or another. So when it comes to maintaining communication, you want to do that to administration, to the people on top of you, and you want to communicate to your team members, and you want to communicate to your volunteers. We all need to know who's working on which projects, what projects are really exciting right now, what projects are a real challenge right now. Do we have new clients that we need to serve? These are all things that need to be communicated to keep everybody on the same page. So you want to communicate to the volunteers very often. You can communicate to them over the phone, by email. You can create periodical volunteer newsletters to send out, just to, you know, hey, you're one of our volunteers, so you are on this newsletter list. And then that could be an e-newsletter or a print newsletter, whichever you find your volunteers are more interested in. And then you want to tell them, you know, what to do if XYZ happens, what to do if you get to Z and you still don't know what to do. You want to send them thank you notes, just communicate to your volunteers a lot. That volunteer manual will be a huge communication tool. And it doesn't even have to be, it doesn't have to be a whole big thick manual, you know, the manual can literally be 2 pages, but it just covers what to do in certain situations. And you also want to communicate to the administration. You want to communicate statistics. We had 7 volunteers serve 36 clients for a total hours of, you know, 5 hours. You want to keep those statistics and keep sending them up the chain to let people know that your program is working and it's needed, and I mean it's being used. And you can mention this in newsletters. If your library sends out quarterly newsletters or monthly newsletters, you know, save a little space for what's happening with your volunteers and what they're doing. Feature a volunteer of the week. You could even do that on, you know, social media. Talk about exciting projects that these volunteers are doing, and then get feedback from recipients of the service and include those in your notes to administration. If you have a home delivery service client who's like super happy with their volunteer and they call you and they say, oh, I'm so glad you keep sending me these books. I don't know what I would do without them. And Othel's so nice when he comes to bring me the books. It's just wonderful. I love the service. Make sure that you send that up the chain and also back to the volunteers. Give compliments when compliments are due. So speaking of compliments, we're going to talk about respect and gratitude. We want to make sure that staff knows that volunteers are on the same team as the staff. And because an unrecognized volunteer perceives that they weren't treated with respect, they could call the director, and then the director could be like, hey, Maggie, you know, this volunteer feels like we don't treat them good enough and they're not going to volunteer here anymore. What's going on with your volunteer program? And that's when I'm like, oh no, something really bad happened. So make sure everyone knows that everyone's on the same team and that we're all working towards the same goals, and that we all have the same goal. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. So honor the commitment of these volunteers. Say thank you. Feature them in social media posts. Send them birthday, thank you, anniversaries of when they started volunteering. Give them little bios and newsletters. Give them credit when it's due. Maybe even give them like an after hours access, you know, like, hey, staff gets here at 9 o'clock, but we don't open till 10, but we'll let volunteers in at 9 o'clock so that, you know, you can have access to the whole library without anybody else in it. Give them recognition, breakfast, lunch, and dinners, that kind of thing. But if it doesn't work out, if you have a volunteer and things just aren't working out, it's okay. Not every dream is a nightmare, but sometimes things just don't work out. And so that's when you have substitutes ready. Um, it, it's really tricky if it doesn't work out with your volunteer, because you want to try to either move them to a different position or kind of end that position altogether. So you need a plan for if it doesn't work out. And then you need a backup plan for that. So the first thing is preventing the whole it doesn't work out scenario. You want to use the interview, the application, and the volunteer manual that I mentioned as a way to kind of weed through volunteers and make sure you're getting them in the right spot. You need to know their motivation for volunteering. If they want to volunteer because they have to do court-ordered hours, you want to consider that in your volunteer plan. Are you going to accept those types of volunteers? You want to clearly communicate volunteer expectations and commitments to them. So that's all part of the prevention. We're going to try to prevent when it goes south. But if it does go south, you can reassign that volunteer to another position. For example, I had a volunteer who was helping me with a digitization project. And we were digitizing old newspapers, and we were digitizing them on a flatbed scanner. And she was so rough with these newspapers. And the scans were always crooked, and there was always something missing, and it just, I'd see her manhandling these fragile old newspapers, and it's just, oh no, so what can this person do? Because digitization is not good for her. Let's have her pull some books for reading. Let's just shift her from one thing to the other. And you ask, like, hey, thank you for doing your work on that project. Would you mind working on this other project instead? If that doesn't work, you can ask them to move to a volunteer substitute position. Yes, it's such a thing. And they are really important. A substitute volunteer position fills in when another substitute who we are counting on cannot perform their duties. So if you have a volunteer who just doesn't have a good fit anywhere, you can ask them to be a sub for a different volunteer position. That keeps them connected, and it keeps them involved while letting the other volunteers kind of absorb that other work and take care of it themselves. And then sometimes you got to say, I'm so sorry, things have changed, and your volunteer position, we don't need it anymore. Or you can say, I'm so sorry, but my boss says that we're not doing volunteers anymore. Or you can say, hey, thanks so much for your help, but we're good right now. We don't need any help. And it's a bummer when things go south, and you have to like break off your relationship with a volunteer. But the goal is to prevent that. The goal is to prevent breaking up with a volunteer. So I've gone through this pretty quickly, but I haven't had any questions. Usually I get some questions. So here's your list of references. These are some of the materials that I used when I was putting together this presentation. There's links included on the slide, which you'll get when you download the presentation. Here are more links to some other resources. I mean, if you liked this presentation, then I highly recommend following these links for more information. Okay, and then where did I go? Oh, I went to a link. And then, and yes.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. These are 4 books that I recommend for further reading. If you don't have these within your library system, I would definitely interlibrary loan them. They're also available on Amazon if you want to request for your library to purchase them. But if you are looking for further reading, if you want books to cite, I would definitely go with this. And are there any questions?
Yes, so we have had a few come in. So the presentation slides should be available tomorrow, as well as the recording. We usually allow about 24 hours for getting that posted, just because we have to download the recording and edit it and then upload it to YouTube. So there is in the follow-up email, it shares the link where that will be posted. So yeah, so you can look for that around this time tomorrow. It should be available. If you do have a question for Maggie, we have plenty of time to take some, so we will do that now. Okay, so we have had a few that have came in, and Maggie, I want to say thank you again for pivoting. And I know it wasn't convenient for participants to view this presentation on your phone, but sometimes we have to do that, and you did very well. I would have completely panicked, and you have been so calm. So good for you. That's amazing. So yeah, some things happen, and sometimes we just have to adjust and pivot and go to plan B. So thank you for doing that. Okay, the first question is, how do you address when volunteers gossip or when there's pettiness between them? Any tips on that?
Okay, so I'm surprised I didn't have more information about this in my slide, now that I come to think about it, but that volunteer handbook that I mentioned should handle situations like this. Just like a staff manual or a staff handbook handles like behavior in the workplace, a volunteer manual or a volunteer handbook can address this before it even starts. And then just like a paid employee, if you have a volunteer and your gentle nudge is like, hey, I noticed, I overheard so-and-so and you kind of talking, and I just wanted to let you know that that's kind of not one of our expectations with volunteers. That sort of thing. You could rearrange the schedule so that the gossiping volunteers don't work with one another. You could, and if it's that bad, like, is it the kind of, are they gossiping about patrons or other employees or the behind the scenes of the library? Because what you don't want, and what should be outlined in that volunteer manual with their expectations of how they conduct themselves within the library. If there is a dust bunny under this rickety old book truck that is stuck in acquisitions, and it's been there for months, and there's a nasty dust bunny underneath it, you don't want your volunteers going out and telling people that kind of stuff. That's like a library trade secret. So that should definitely be covered in the volunteer handbook, along with gossiping, and pettiness. But then again, you will always have gossiping and pettiness to a certain extent. They just go hand in hand with humanity.
Yes. Yes. So along those lines, how do you address volunteers who might not show up at all, or who are inconsistent when showing up when you think they're going to?
That's where the job description, the interview, the expectations, making sure that they know that you expect them to be there, making sure that they know that they have committed to you. Because like I said, some volunteers, myself included, when I was, a teenager, I didn't realize that the people I was volunteering for were actually counting on me. I thought I was just showing up as an extra on set. So communicating with these volunteers, letting them know how valuable they are, letting them know that you do count on them, and then giving them clear expectations in the beginning will prevent this type of thing from happening in theory. However, if it is happening, just setting them down, and being, hey, I noticed a lot of times, we've really been missing you. We've had to call subs in to cover your shift, or, maybe ask them to schedule less volunteer hours, so that they know that they can be there when you need them. Does that help?
Yeah, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Here's another question for you. My staff and I have inherited a cadre of long-term volunteers who are used to and interested in a very problematic culture. Do you have any thoughts about how to transition volunteer culture in a way that minimizes attrition?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yes.
Um, I think any tactic employed by a manager who takes the position of a team who has that type of work culture, any tactics used by in professional paid work will work for volunteers as well. However, my aunt, my aunt, she just came into my head right now, and she just says, "Kill them with kindness." So I would throw them a party, and I would, make it, would do a presentation during the party about the expectations, use all the excuses in the book, say administration says we expect this from our volunteers, say, hey, volunteers, we really appreciate what you do when you do this, and just throw all of your like people champion skills at them, and then for the recruit new volunteers as well. Recruit new volunteers to hopefully, it will take time. It will take time. Just like when any department or team needs a complete overhaul, it's just going to take time.
Thank you. And someone mentioned in the question panel that we have our volunteers sign the same confidentiality agreement that the staff sign. That's a great idea. That can, I would imagine, help minimize maybe some of the gossip that might be happening in that kind of environment.
That's really
okay. Yeah, so here's another situation. So we are located in a college town and often have student service organizations that want to volunteer at the library. We love their assistance with programs and events, but find it prohibitive to conduct criminal background checks for these students that may participate in these one and done programs, and they're working with youth. So these students are often future educators and are seeking that hands-on experience working with youth and families. So they would not be interested in working behind the scenes. What do you advise?
I would keep them supervised. A supervised volunteer may not necessarily need that criminal background check. I mean, if you are physically in the room with them that whole time, I would definitely check with administration to see, what policy works best for your library. There's no, despite everything I just said, there's no one right way to do things. Everyone is going to have to like bend and shape for the best fit for their need. And so in your situation, I would just make sure that library staff accompany these students to the programs, at least to observe or to assist, just to prevent anyone saying, I signed my kids up for this library program and it wasn't even a library staff member putting it on, Also, on the promotional materials for these programs, I would make sure to say that this is being presented by students from, this university for the purposes of their future educational career. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Another question is, can you give a brief how-to about doing background checks on volunteers?
So I've never done a background check. All I've ever done is filled out the form and collected the form. Every library I've ever worked that does background checks, they are handled by the director of the library. So I can't give you a walkthrough on how to do a background check. There's a form that you have to fill out that gives permission for the background check, and then there's services out there that provide background checks, some for a fee. Some libraries, I know they partner with the local school system, so the school system does the background checks for free. No, I think it just all depends.
Okay, and then how long is the turnaround typically when you do that?
I know my background check was a month. No, 3 days. I know my background check was 3 days.
Okay, so that is pretty quick. All right, thank you. Another question is, I like the idea of recognizing volunteers and posting things about them on social media, and acknowledging anniversaries. Does and can this ever create some animosity with staff when this is with actual staff when this is happening, and how do you prevent that?
Well, I would hope you do for your staff what you do for your volunteers. Everything I said here is just as good, from a manager to a team standpoint. You use all of your recognition tools for all of your people. I mean, your team's your team. Recognize them as well as your volunteers. By keeping your staff on board, maybe putting your staff in charge of recognition for volunteers, keeping them involved, keeping them on board, communicating with them, and then also, recognizing them. I mean, I've never seen a librarian turn down a donut or a slice of pizza.
That's true. That's true. Someone mentioned, as far as background checks, in Wisconsin, I would use the state, but during COVID, they take longer. So, so that's good to know. Good to know. And a link was shared there, so I will share that in the chat area.
Oh, I love it when people get together and help.
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So maybe just any last thoughts about volunteers, or I guess, keeping volunteers safe, or do you have them adhere to the same kind of COVID guidelines as you would your staff typically as they're coming back in the library?
This is okay. In my current position, and I'm going to share this with you because y'all are in Wisconsin and I'm in Ohio. So in our current situation, we, the staff at my library is we are wearing our masks, we are hand sanitizing, we are staying 6 feet apart. We have vinyl barriers between all of our desks. The staff very much has all bought into this. Our volunteers have not. Volunteers have not. So we don't require them to follow like all of the, it's not required. If they want to be here and work, however, we do require them to follow the patron guidelines. And the patron guidelines are, please wear a mask, but we can't make you.
Okay.
So we do, yeah, they are required to wear shoes and follow by patron guidelines.
And you have found that has worked for your library?
Yes, our volunteers came back. It worked for us. We're glad to have them. They poke their heads around, all of our barriers and stuff.
Yeah.
It's just because they want to say hi and hello and they want to touch base.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Maggie, for sharing this information and for the great presentation. As I mentioned, the slides and the recording should be posted on our website by tomorrow afternoon. And again, I want to thank all of you for participating today, for your great questions. If you missed any of the webinars in this fall staff empowerment series, they are also, the other 2 webinars and slides are already posted. So feel free to go back and check out those. This was a great series. We had 3 excellent presentations. So again, I want to thank all of you for being with us this afternoon. I want to thank Maggie for the great presentation, Shauna for being here and assisting. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. And so long.